Carla sat in her first-class seat 1B, her fingers gripping the armrest as the flight took off from New York. She felt the familiar hum of the engines beneath her. Her mind was still heavy from the week of endless meetings, but for now she could finally relax when the flight attendant walked down the aisle, her polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. Carla caught a glimpse of her eyes, the briefest flash, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just a professional glance, it was a look that seemed to measure her, as though she didn't belong here, as though Carla was some sort of inconvenience. The flight attendant moved past her. Without a word, Carla's stomach tightened, but she brushed it off. The seat was comfortable, and she had a long flight ahead of her, so she tried to focus on her laptop, trying to drown out the growing discomfort in her chest. A few minutes passed, and the attendant returned to check on passengers. She paused in front of Carla, who was busy typing, trying to concentrate, her hand frozen on the keyboard. When the attendant didn't speak, just hovered for a moment, too long. The tension in the air thickened. Carla glanced up and met her eyes again. This time, the flight attendant's gaze lingered for just a second too long before she moved away with a tight smile. Carla's heart pounded suddenly. The air felt colder, and the unease she had been trying to ignore took root deep inside her. Something didn't feel right, and it wasn't just a random awkwardness. As the meal service began, Carla asked for a small change in her order. It wasn't much, just a simple request, but when she spoke, the attendant glanced at her with a barely contained sigh before nodding curtly and walking away. Carla could feel her cheeks flush. The awkwardness was unmistakable, but what really bothered her wasn't the dismissive attitude. It was the feeling that she was being judged. Carla couldn't place it, but the more the attendant interacted with her, the more Carla felt like she was invisible to her, but not in the way that was normal for a busy flight when you're surrounded by strangers. No, this was different. It was as if she wasn't supposed to be there in the first-class section, like she had somehow snuck into a world where she didn't belong. Carla's mind raced. She had spent years working hard to climb to the top of her career, had fought for her seat in this world, and yet now she felt like she was being punished for something she couldn't quite figure out. She looked around at the other passengers. Everyone was in their own world, busy with their laptops, reading books, or chatting quietly. No one was paying attention to her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the flight attendant was watching her every move, keeping her distance, just a little too carefully. Carla sighed quietly and turned her attention back to her laptop, but the unease lingered like a dark cloud threatening to ruin the rest of the journey. Just as she was about to pull up her emails, the flight attendant walked past again. Carla glanced up briefly and caught her looking at her once more. This time the flight attendant didn't even try to hide it. Her gaze was full of something Carla couldn't define. Was it suspicion? Was it disdain? Whatever it was, it made her skin crawl. And for the first time since she had boarded the flight, she wasn't sure if she wanted to finish this journey. Carla tried to shake the feeling off, but it clung to her like a shadow. No matter how much she tried to focus on her work, the cold stare from the flight attendant kept playing in the back of her mind. It wasn't just one glance anymore. It was an ongoing undercurrent of tension. The flight attendant would pass by every so often, and Carla noticed that each time the woman's eyes flicked over her, there was something more than just disinterest. It was judgment wrapped in indifference. Each time she walked by, Carla couldn't help but notice how the attendant treated her differently from everyone else. When Carla asked for a glass of water earlier, the woman had barely acknowledged her request. Her voice was short and clipped, and the way she delivered the service was almost mechanical. When Carla had looked around, the other passengers were treated with more warmth and patience than she had received. Carla knew that she was no stranger to being in spaces where she didn't always feel welcomed, but this felt different. She'd have been in plenty of first-class cabins before, and had always felt a sense of ease, but this time the feeling of exclusion was suffocating. She tried to push it aside, telling herself that she was overthinking it, but with each interaction, The tension only grew stronger. Now the flight attendant wasn't just cold, she was almost hostile. In her indifference, Carla felt the sting of it more sharply each time, and couldn't help but wonder what was going on in the woman's mind. The discomfort continued to escalate. As the flight wore on, Carla glanced out the window watching the clouds pass by, but the unease still gnawed at her gut. She wasn't used to feeling so vulnerable, so out of place on a flight like this. It was supposed to be a time to relax. But all she could think about was the woman's eyes that seemed to be constantly watching her. Carla shifted in her seat uncomfortably as she heard the soft clicks of the attendant's shoes approaching again. She kept her head down this time, pretending to focus on the in-flight magazine in front of her, as if she were just another passenger doing her best to ignore the feeling of being singled out. But the flight attendant didn't stop this time. She passed by without a glance, offering nothing more than a stiff smile that was so fake Carla almost felt sick to her stomach. As the minutes passed, Carla became more and more convinced that the flight attendant wasn't just cold, she was avoiding her actively. This wasn't just a case of bad service. It was as if Carla didn't deserve the same courtesy that the other passengers received. The more she thought about it, the more her anger began to rise. But she was also confused. Why was she being treated this way? She looked around at the other passengers. None of them seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary, but Carla felt it as clearly, as if it were written in bold letters. She didn't belong here, not in the way they did. And that was the problem. She had worked so hard to earn her place in this world, but today it felt like that effort meant nothing. And then it happened. Carla needed to speak to the flight attendant again, a simple request this time. But the woman's cold reception was sharper than ever. As she walked down the aisle past Carla's seat, she made no effort to acknowledge her. She didn't stop. She didn't ask. If Carla needed anything, the simple act of acknowledgement was withheld from her, as if she were invisible. Carla's heart thudded in her chest, a quiet humiliation settling over her. She was determined not to let it show, but inside she was boiling with a feeling she couldn't name. She knew it wasn't her imagination anymore. Something was definitely wrong. Carla's frustration grew with every passing minute. She glanced around the cabin, looking for some sort of reassurance from the other passengers. But no one seemed to notice the tension that weighed heavily on her shoulders. The quiet hum of the plane and the occasional cough from a fellow passenger were the only sounds breaking the silence. But Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The coldness from the flight attendant had turned into something more unsettling. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was deliberate, and Carla could feel it every time their eyes met. For a split second, a chill would run down her spine. It was as if the woman was daring her to react, daring her to say something. Carla leaned back in her seat, her thoughts swirling as the plane continued its journey toward the west coast. She had done everything right. She had earned her seat in first class through years of hard work. But none of that seemed to matter here. The flight attendant's behavior made her feel like an outsider, as if she didn't belong in the same space as the other passengers, who were all being treated with courtesy and respect. Carla knew she was being paranoid. But the more she thought about it, the more everything started to feel like a calculated attempt to put her in her place. She tried to push the thoughts aside, telling herself it was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. But deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. And then came the moment that would change everything. As the flight attendant walked by once more, Carla's patience finally snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to speak up without thinking. She stood up from her seat and called out to the woman who was just a few steps away. The flight attendant stopped in her tracks, her back straightening, as if she had been expecting this. All along, the cold stare she gave Carla was sharper than ever, her lips curling into a thin line. Carla's heart raced. But she wasn't going to back down. She had to know why she was being treated like this, why she was being singled out, when she was supposed to be enjoying the same luxury as everyone else. The flight attendant turned slowly, her eyes never leaving Carla's face, and with a voice that was almost too calm. She said something that took Carla completely by surprise. You really shouldn't be here in first class. She said the words so quietly that Carla almost didn't hear them at first. But when they sank in, her blood ran cold. It was as if the world had suddenly stopped spinning, and she was standing in a dream or a nightmare one that she couldn't escape from. Carla stared at the woman in disbelief, her minds struggling to process the meaning behind those words. What did she mean by that? What was the flight attendant implying? The woman's eyes never wavered, still cold, still calculating. Carla opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her thoughts were racing, but everything felt surreal. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Carla's gaze flicked around the room, desperately searching for anyone to acknowledge what was happening. But the other passengers were too absorbed in their own little worlds. No one seemed to notice the exchange taking place right in front of them. It was like Carla had become invisible again. Only this time it felt different. This time it felt like the entire plane was in on something that she wasn't privy to. And just as quickly as the tension had built up, the flight attendant turned and walked away without another word, leaving Carla standing there with her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling from the bizarre encounter. But it wasn't over. Carla knew that much deep down. She could feel it. This wasn't just an isolated incident. Something was happening, something that was bigger than her. And she couldn't help but wonder what the flight attendant knew that she didn't. Carla stood there, frozen, unable to move. Her heart raced as she tried to process the flight attendant's words. You really shouldn't be here in first class. The phrase echoed in her mind over and over again. But it didn't make sense. She had booked the seat months ago. She had paid for this luxury. She had earned it. Why was she being treated like this? Why was the woman insinuating that she didn't belong? Carla sat back down, her hands trembling as she gripped the armrest, trying to steady herself. But her mind was spinning. The flight attendant's words had cut through the air like a blade and left her in a state of confusion and fear. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. She had always carried herself with confidence. But now she felt as if her very presence was under scrutiny, as if something was wrong with her simply for being there. She couldn't stop looking around at the other passengers. They all seemed oblivious to the tension that had been building between her and the flight attendant. Each one was lost in their own world, unaware of the subtle hostility that was growing in the air. Carla felt alone, as though the entire world had turned its back on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was the target of something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding. What was the flight attendant trying to tell her? What did she know that Carla didn't? The longer Carla sat there, the more she began to notice the subtle changes in the flight attendant's behavior, the way she seemed to hover near Carla's seat, as if waiting for something, the way her eyes flicked over to Carla every time she passed by with a sharpness that felt like a silent accusation. Carla's pulse quickened as she realized that the woman's behavior wasn't just a random occurrence. It was deliberate, and it was aimed at her. Carla took a deep breath and tried to shake off the paranoia, but it wouldn't go away. It was like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the feeling of being judged grew stronger. As the flight continued, Carla's unease only deepened. The flight attendant didn't make any more direct comments, but the coldness in her interactions with Carla never wavered. Every time she brought a drink or meal, the woman would pass her by without a word, without even a smile. But the worst part was the silence between them. It was a silence filled with meaning, a silence that spoke volumes about the tension that simmered beneath the surface. And Carla realized that this wasn't just about bad service. This wasn't just a flight attendant who had a bad day or was having an off moment. No, there was something else going on, something Carla couldn't quite put her finger on, but she could feel it in her bones. Carla's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden jolt. The plane hit some turbulence, and for a moment everything around her seemed to shake. She gripped the armrest tighter, her mind racing. But as the plane settled back into its smooth flight, Carla noticed something else. The flight attendant was standing at the front of the cabin, talking to another crew member, her voice low and hurried. And although Carla couldn't make out the words, she could see the way the attendant looked over her shoulder at her. It was the same look Carla had seen earlier. But now it was filled with something more, a sense of urgency, a sense of purpose that made Carla's blood run cold. What was going on? What had she stumbled into? Who was this flight attendant? And why was she treating Carla like this? It wasn't just about class or status. Something deeper was at play, and Carla was beginning to realize that she wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was a player in something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Carla's heart thudded in her chest as she watched the flight attendant whisper urgently to the other crew member. The conversation was short but intense, and every time the woman glanced over at her, Carla felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if they were plotting something she wasn't supposed to know, and the silence in the cabin only made it worse. The passengers around her were oblivious to the tension that was building up. It felt like she was the only one who was awake to the growing danger. Carla couldn't understand why this was happening. She had done nothing to provoke the flight attendant, nothing to deserve this cold treatment. Yet the longer she sat there, the more she became convinced that there was something personal going on, something hidden just beneath the surface. The flight continued its course, but the unease never left Carla. Her mind kept circling back to the interaction with the attendant and the cryptic words she had said. "You really shouldn't be here in first class." Those words haunted her. They rang in her ears like a constant reminder that she didn't belong here. But why? She had worked hard for this. She had fought her way to the top of her career, and she had earned every luxury. She was entitled to enjoy it just like anyone else. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a question of class. It wasn't just about being in first class. It was something deeper, something that Carla had never expected to face, not in a million years. As the plane continued through the sky, Carla's mind raced with possibilities. Was she being targeted? Was she being singled out because of something she couldn't see? Was there something about her appearance, something about her that made her stand out in a way she hadn't noticed before? She tried to brush the thought aside, but it wouldn't leave her. The more she tried to push it away, the more it consumed her. And that's when it happened. The flight attendant walked down the aisle again. But this time she didn't just pass by. She stopped in front of Carla's seat and looked down at her with those cold, piercing eyes. Carla's heart skipped a beat. But she refused to look away. She had had enough of being intimidated by this woman. She had to know what was going on. The attendant didn't say anything at first. She just stared at Carla, as if sizing her up, as if measuring how much she could get away with. Carla held her breath, waiting for her to speak. When the woman finally did, her voice was low and laced with a quiet venom. "I know who you are," she said, the words slow and deliberate. And it took all of Carla's strength not to flinch. How could she possibly know who Carla was? Had she recognized her from her business dealings? Or was there something more sinister at play? Carla's mind spun, trying to process the words. What did she mean by that? And why was the flight attendant speaking to her like this with such familiarity? But before Carla could respond, the attendant turned on her heel and walked away without another word, leaving Carla sitting in stunned silence, her hands shaking as she gripped the armrests. Once more her mind was racing. She didn't understand. None of this made sense. Why was this woman acting this way toward her? What did she mean by "I know who you are"? And more importantly, what did the flight attendant plan to do with that knowledge? As the minutes ticked by, Carla felt her world closing in around her. The cabin felt smaller, the air felt thicker, and every second stretched on forever. The unease that had settled in her chest now gripped her heart in a vice. She didn't know how much longer she could sit there without exploding. She needed answers, and she needed them now. But the more she thought about the situation, the more Carla realized that this wasn't just about her or the flight attendant. This was about something bigger, something that could change everything for her. Carla sat frozen in her seat, unable to shake off the flight attendant's words. "I know who you are." The phrase lingered in her mind, Like a dark cloud blocking out the light, she stared at the seat in front of her, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had never seen this woman before in her life, so how could she possibly know who Carla was? And why was she treating her this way? Carla had been in difficult situations before. But nothing like this. There was something personal in the air, something that didn't make sense. And that was what scared her. The most, she didn't know who was behind this, or why it was happening. But the fact that it was happening at all was enough to make her skin crawl. She couldn't ignore the feeling in her gut telling her that things were spiraling out of control. She glanced at the other passengers once more, but they were still oblivious to the tension around them. They were laughing, talking, sipping their drinks, completely unaware of what Carla was going through. She felt invisible again. But this time it wasn't the same as before. It was as though she were invisible to everyone except the flight attendant. And that realization made her stomach churn. She could feel the woman's eyes on her. Even when she wasn't looking, she could almost sense the judgment in the air. It was like being watched by a shadow that never left her side. The flight continued its long journey with the usual noise and hum of the aircraft. But for Carla, every minute felt like an eternity. The more she thought about the situation, the more she realized how little she knew about the woman who was now fixated on her. Who was she? And what did she want with Carla? Why was she acting like this? Was she part of some greater scheme? Was it possible that the flight attendant knew something about Carla's past that no one else did? Carla's mind raced back through the years. She had worked hard to get to where she was today. She had built her business from the ground up, had made a name for herself in the corporate world. But that had never come easily. It had taken years of struggle, sacrifice, and dealing with people who didn't always have her best interests at heart. But none of them had ever gone this far. None of them had ever made her feel like this. She had fought too hard to be where she was. And now someone was trying to tear her down for reasons she couldn't understand. She shook her head in disbelief. But no matter how hard she tried to push the thought away, it kept coming back. Was this personal? Was there something from her past that had caught up with her, something she had forgotten? Her thoughts were interrupted as the flight attendant passed by again. But this time there was no subtle glance, no cold stare. Instead, the woman stopped directly in front of Carla's seat and leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing as she spoke in a voice so quiet Carla almost didn't hear her. "I remember you." The words were simple, but the way she said them sent a chill through Carla's spine. It was as if the woman knew things about Carla's life, things that no one else could possibly know. But how and why was this flight attendant digging into her past? Was it a coincidence, or had someone been watching her? The unease that had been simmering inside Carla now turned into a boiling fear. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as the flight attendant lingered just a moment longer than necessary before walking away, leaving Carla in a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and anger. She needed to know what was going on. She had to figure out who this woman was and what she wanted before it was too late, before the entire flight became a trap from which she couldn't escape. Carla stood up abruptly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wasn't going to wait around to be tormented. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront the flight attendant head-on. But as she made her way down the aisle towards the galley, she saw the attendant once more, this time speaking to another crew member, her expression unreadable. But the way the two of them looked at Carla made her blood run cold. It was like they were discussing her, as though she were some kind of puzzle. They were trying to solve something about her life that she didn't even understand yet. Carla froze, her feet suddenly heavy. She couldn't move as the cold realization hit her. There was something much bigger going on than just a flight attendant with an attitude. This was personal, and she was caught right in the middle of it. Carla stood frozen, her eyes locked on the flight attendants in the galley, her mind racing. As she tried to make sense of what she had just witnessed, the cold glance exchanged between the two crew members was enough to make her heart race. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to make a move. But she wasn't ready. She wasn't prepared to confront them. Yet she couldn't let them know she was onto them. Not yet. Instead, she turned slowly and made her way back to her seat, every step feeling heavier than the last. Her thoughts were clouded with confusion, fear, and anger. She couldn't understand why this was happening, why she was being treated like this by people she had never even met, and why it felt like her every move was being watched, every action analyzed. The plane continued to hum around her as the minutes dragged on, but Carla couldn't shake the feeling that she was trapped. She tried to focus on her breathing, tried to ignore the ever-growing knot in her stomach. But it was impossible. She felt like she was caught in a web slowly tightening around her with every second that passed. She needed to know who these flight attendants were and what they wanted from her. But more than that, she needed to know why this was happening now. She couldn't think of a single reason why someone would go to such lengths to target her. It wasn't as though she had enemies. Not like this. No one knew about her personal life. No one knew the things she had buried deep inside her. But somehow someone on this flight knew something they weren't telling her. As the flight continued, Carla kept her eyes fixed on the galley, her gaze never straying from the two flight attendants, who seemed to be talking in hushed tones every now. And then one of them would glance over at Carla, but each time their eyes met, Carla felt a rush of cold panic flood through her veins. They were planning something, but what she could feel it in her gut, that this wasn't just about bad service, or even a misunderstanding. There was something darker at play, and she was stuck in the middle of it. It wasn't until the plane began its descent that Carla decided to take action. She had been waiting long enough. It was time to confront them. But as she rose from her seat, the thought of what could happen next made her hesitate. What if she was wrong? What if there was no grand conspiracy, and she was just paranoid? But the way the flight attendants had been acting, the way they had treated her, everything about this situation screamed that something was off. She couldn't back down now. She couldn't let herself be pushed around anymore. Carla walked briskly toward the galley, her mind set on getting answers. But as she reached the back of the plane, she froze. The flight attendants were no longer there. They had disappeared just as quickly as they had appeared. It was as though they had melted into the walls of the plane. And for a moment Carla thought she might have imagined the entire thing. Maybe this was all just a series of coincidences. Maybe she was simply overreacting. But then she saw it, a small folded piece of paper resting on the counter in the galley. Her heart skipped a beat, and without thinking she grabbed it quickly, tucking it into her pocket. As she turned to head back to her seat, her pulse racing, as the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. As she sat back down in her seat, Carla pulled out the note, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. The words were brief, but the message was clear. Meet me after the plane lands. Don't tell anyone. And don't try to leave the airport, or you'll regret it. The note was unsigned, but the message felt like a threat, and yet it was the first direct communication she had received from whoever was behind all of this. It was the first tangible clue that she wasn't imagining things, that this wasn't just some strange series of events, but a carefully orchestrated game. Carla's mind whirled as she read the note again and again, trying to decipher its meaning. Who had left it there? Who wanted to meet her? And why was she being forced into this confrontation? What would happen when the plane landed? What did they want from her? The plane's wheels touched down with a sudden jolt, but it felt like the beginning of a nightmare for Carla. She couldn't stop thinking about the note, the warning, the threat. She had no idea what awaited her at the airport. But one thing was certain: the moment she stepped off this plane, she would no longer be the same person she had been when she boarded. Carla's hands trembled as the plane taxied toward the gate, her eyes fixed on the note, clenched tightly in her palm. The words still burned in her mind. Meet me after the plane lands. Don't tell anyone. And don't try to leave the airport, or you'll regret it. She had no idea who was behind this, or what they wanted from her. But one thing was certain: she couldn't ignore it any longer. The tension in the air was thick as the plane came to a halt, and the seatbelt sign clicked off the moment the fastened seatbelt light went out. Carla stood up quickly. She had to act fast. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. She had to get to the bottom of this before it was too late. As the other passengers stood up and started gathering their things, Carla felt the familiar weight of all eyes on her once again. But this time it didn't matter. She was past the point of caring. She was determined to find out who was behind this mystery. She moved through the aisle quickly and efficiently, trying to block out the whispers of her fellow travelers. She could feel their curiosity, the way they eyed her as she passed. But she didn't care. All she cared about was getting off this plane and finding the person who had been pulling the strings. As she reached the door, she hesitated for just a moment, looking around to see if anyone was following her. She was sure that she was being watched, but she didn't know by who. The flight attendants had already disappeared, and there was no sign of the crew member who had left the note. But Carla wasn't foolish enough to think this was over. She wasn't going to walk into a trap. Without knowing the risks, she took a deep breath and stepped off the plane into the bustling airport terminal. The noise, the crowds, the constant movement around her, all of it felt like a world away from the suffocating tension she had just left behind. But as she walked through the terminal, Carla felt her skin crawl with every step. She was being followed. She knew it. Her instincts were screaming at her to turn around. But she kept her head down and continued walking, her pulse quickening with each passing moment. She had no idea who was watching her, but she had a feeling she wouldn't be alone for long. She had no choice but to play along, to see where this led her. If she could just get to the rendezvous point and confront whoever was behind this, she could finally get answers, and maybe, just maybe, find a way out of this nightmare. She checked her watch. It was almost time to meet whoever had left the note. Carla's mind raced with possibilities. What if this was a setup? What if it was someone she knew, someone from her past, someone who'd have been watching her all along? Or what if it was someone entirely new, someone with a grudge against her? She had so many questions and not nearly enough answers. She could feel the sweat building on her brow as she walked toward the designated meeting spot. She couldn't shake the feeling that every step was leading her closer to something she wasn't ready for. When she arrived at the spot, she stopped and looked around. There were people everywhere, travelers rushing to their gates, people chatting on the phone. No one seemed out of place. But Carla knew that someone was watching her. She could feel it. She took a deep breath and stepped into a quieter corner of the terminal and waited. It felt like hours before someone finally approached her. But when they did, she didn't see it coming. The figure who stepped out from the crowd was a man, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. But as he drew closer, Carla's heart stopped. She knew that face. She had seen it before, but where? It took her a moment to place it. But when she did, her stomach twisted in disbelief. It was one of the flight attendants, the very one who had been giving her the cold treatment from the beginning. She had known it was a setup, but she hadn't expected this. The man stopped just a few feet away, his eyes locked on hers. And for the first time, Carla saw something familiar in his expression, something almost human. But it was fleeting. As he quickly regained his composure and his cold demeanor returned, he took a step forward, his voice low and measured. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. But there was no turning back now. Carla had made her choice, and she was about to learn the truth of just how deep this rabbit hole went.